Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into something a bit meta today, I guess
Yeah.
you could say.
Data.
Yeah, a guide literally titled How to Think. And I have to admit, when I first saw the title,
Okay.
I was like, don't, I already know how to do that. But
Yeah.
the intro really grabbed me. It digs into the why behind thinking about thinking.
It's interesting, right? We just kind of go through life on autopilot so often. This guide is more about awareness of those mental processes, not about dictating one right way to think.
I think that's a really good point. It
Okay.
feels more like an invitation to a conversation,
Yeah.
right? Like
Have
the
you?
author's saying, hey, let's think about this together, which, by the way, they even used AI as a tool to help organize the ideas in this guide.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool example of using tools to enhance thinking, which actually ties into one of the guide's big themes, balance.
Absolutely. It's not about rejecting technology or intuition,
Yeah.
but finding how those things can work together.
Right. And one of the first things that jumped out at me was this idea of balancing openness and skepticism,
Oh,
especially in today's world where we're just flooded with information from all sides. How do we even sort through it all?
you've got to be able to separate the signal from the noise, for sure.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
how do we walk that tightrope? The guide seems to suggest that it's not about picking one side or the other,
Right.
but about weaving them together,
Yeah.
being open to new ideas, but at the same time, asking tough questions, demanding evidence, thinking critically about what we're taking in.
Absolutely. You've got to have that healthy skepticism to avoid just falling for misinformation or following so-called experts blindly.
Which brings us to these core principles the guide outlines, almost like tools for building a stronger thinking process. Openness, skepticism, critical thinking, and even emotional intelligence.
Yeah, they all play a part.
Okay, let's break those down a bit. We've touched on openness and skepticism, but what about critical thinking? What does that actually look like when you're putting it into practice?
I think of it as really engaging with information, not just passively consuming it. You're analyzing the evidence, thinking about underlying assumptions, evaluating the logic of arguments, making connections.
So it's about going a step further than just absorbing information. You're dissecting it, you're questioning it, you're
Yeah,
coming to your own conclusions.
exactly.
And then there's emotional intelligence, which seems maybe a little out of place in a guide about thinking.
Right.
But the guide argues that our emotions play a huge role in how we think and make decisions.
They really do.
So it's not about ignoring our emotions, but understanding how they influence us and using that awareness to make more balanced choices.
That's the key. Recognizing when your emotions might be clouding your judgment or leading you to biased thinking.
So we're starting to build a pretty powerful toolkit here. But how do we actually apply all this? The guide mentions these pillars of thought, culture, science, and philosophy, almost like lenses to view the world through.
I like that analogy.
Yeah. So it's about recognizing that there are multiple ways to understand things, each lens bringing its own valuable perspective.
Right.
Culture helps us understand values and beliefs. Science helps us understand the natural world. Philosophy helps us grapple with those big existential questions.
Yeah. You need all of them for a well-rounded understanding.
So it's not about picking one pillar as the right one, but appreciating what each one offers, using them together to make sense of complex issues.
I think that's a great point. And this idea of combining different perspectives also comes up when the guide introduces the cycle of thought. It's presented as a framework for navigating the entire thinking process from start to finish.
I'm really intrigued by this cycle. It starts with gathering information,
Yeah.
but it goes way beyond just collecting data.
Uh-huh.
It emphasizes organizing that information, distilling the key takeaways,
Mhm.
and then expressing those insights effectively.
Yeah. It's like taking raw materials and transforming them into something valuable. And each stage of that cycle requires different skills, a mindful approach.
So it's not enough to just be a sponge soaking up information.
Yeah.
You have to actively shape that information into something meaningful, something you can use.
Exactly. And that's where those principles we talked about really come in. Openness, skepticism, critical thinking. When you're gathering information, openness means actively seeking out diverse sources.
Right. Not just staying in our little echo chambers.
Exactly. You want to consider different viewpoints. Then skepticism kicks in to help you evaluate those sources.
Okay, so you're looking for biases,
Yeah.
checking the evidence, spotting any red flags.
Right. It's not about blindly accepting everything you read. You're applying that critical lens.
And then critical thinking helps you make sense of it all.
Yeah, you're looking for patterns, making connections, drawing your own conclusions based on reason and evidence, not just what someone's telling you.
It's about being an active participant in figuring things out.
Exactly. And the cycle doesn't stop there. Once you've got those key insights, you need to express them.
Okay, so whether that's Writing or speaking or even just having a conversation, you have to be able to communicate your ideas clearly and persuasively.
Absolutely. And this is where emotional intelligence comes in again.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Because good communication is a two-way street. You have to understand your audience, tailor your message, connect with them on an emotional level.
So it's not just about the thinking part, it's about the human element too.
Exactly. Thinking and relating to others go hand in hand. One thing this guide really emphasizes is self-awareness,
Oh, recognizing our own biases, that kind of thing.
right? It's crucial for effective thinking because we all have biases, these ingrained patterns that can really trip us up.
These mental shortcuts that we don't even realize we're using.
Yeah, and they can come from anywhere. Our upbringing, our culture, experiences, even our biology.
So it's like having these hidden filters shaping our perceptions, affecting our decisions without us even knowing.
Exactly. One of the most common is confirmation bias. We tend to look for information that confirms what we already believe.
And ignore anything that challenges our views.
Right. Especially nowadays with all the information overload. It's so easy to get stuck in those echo chambers.
Yeah, it takes real effort to break out of that.
Absolutely. Then there's the availability heuristic. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of things that are easy to remember or that we see a lot in the media.
So if you've been watching a lot of news about shark attacks,
You might start thinking they're way more common than they are, even though statistically you're more likely to, I don't know, get hit by lightning.
it's like our sense of danger is skewed by whatever's most vivid in our minds.
Right. And then there's anchoring bias. We rely too much on the first piece of information we get, even if it's totally irrelevant.
Okay, so if I'm negotiating a salary and the first offer is way too low, that might anchor my expectations, even though I deserve more.
Precisely. And these are just a few examples. There are tons of these cognitive biases out there.
It's a bit mind-blowing when you start thinking about it.
It is. But the good news is, the more aware we are of these biases, the better equipped we are to counteract them, to make more objective decisions.
So it's not about getting rid of our biases entirely. Probably impossible.
Right.
It's about being conscious of them, questioning our assumptions.
Absolutely. And that brings us back to the core message of this guide. Learning to think effectively is a journey.
Not a destination.
Right. It's about constantly questioning, exploring, refining our understanding.
It's about growing, basically.
Exactly. And one thing that I really appreciate about the guide is its emphasis on asking better questions.
Okay, so not just having the right answers, but knowing which questions to ask in the first place.
Precisely. Because the quality of our thinking is often directly tied to the quality of our questions.
It's like the guide is saying, don't just accept things at face value, dig deeper, challenge assumptions.
Yeah. And by asking thoughtful questions, we can unlock new levels of understanding and insight.
It can help us uncover biases and even see new possibilities.
Absolutely. And the guide highlights specific types of questions that are particularly effective, like open-ended questions.
Okay, so instead of asking, is climate change real? You might ask, what are the different perspectives on climate change?
Right. That opens up a much richer and more nuanced conversation.
It invites people to think more critically instead of just giving a yes or no answer.
Exactly. Another powerful type is Socratic questioning.
I've heard of that, but remind me.
It involves asking a series of questions designed to challenge assumptions, expose contradictions.
To really get someone thinking deeply about their own beliefs.
Yeah, it's like guiding them on a journey of self-discovery through questions.
That's a great way to put it. So by practicing these kinds of questioning techniques, we can improve our own thinking and help others do the same.
It's about fostering a culture of curiosity and critical thinking, both within ourselves and in our interactions with the world.
I like that. Speaking of curiosity, this guide also acknowledges the role of intuition in thinking.
Right, which might seem a little counterintuitive at first.
Yeah, considering how much we've been talking about logic and evidence.
I know. But the guide argues that while logic and evidence are essential, intuition also has its place. It can be a source of creative insights, even ethical guidance. That gut feeling that tells you what's right even if you can't fully explain it.
So it's not about ignoring our intuition, but understanding when it's valuable and when we need to balance it with a more rational approach.
Exactly. And one way to cultivate our intuition is to pay attention to those gut feelings, reflect on them, try to understand where they're coming from.
And to balance intuition with logic, we can ask ourselves, what evidence supports this feeling? What are the potential consequences? Are there other perspectives?
Yeah, you're essentially fact-checking your intuition.
That's a good way to think about it. So we're not just blindly following our gut, but giving it due consideration. One last thing I wanted to touch on is uncertainty,
Ah, yes, the unavoidable part of life.
especially these days, with so much changing so rapidly
Mhm.
and all the conflicting information out there.
It's tempting to try and find certainty, easy answers, but the guide encourages us to embrace uncertainty, to recognize it as part of the human experience.
It's about learning to be comfortable with not knowing, because sometimes there just aren't any definitive answers.
Right, and that requires a real shift in mindset, letting go of that need for absolute certainty.
It's about being okay with ambiguity and complexity.
Exactly. And one way to get better at that is through mindfulness.
Okay, so being present in the moment without judgment.
Right. By focusing on the here and now, we can let go of worries about the future or regrets about the past.
It helps us to just be.
Exactly. And when we're present, we're more aware of our thoughts and feelings. We can observe them without getting swept away.
Which is really helpful when dealing with uncertainty, because it allows us to step back from our anxieties and see things more clearly.
Precisely. It's not about ignoring our emotions or pretending we're not uncertain. It's about acknowledging them without letting them control us.
So we're developing this ability to be present with uncertainty, to see it not as a threat, but as a potential opportunity,
It's a chance for growth, for new discoveries.
for embracing the unknown.
Yeah, it really is. As we've been going through this guide, it's become clear that how to think isn't just about, mastering logic or memorizing facts.
It's more about cultivating a mindset, a way of approaching not just information, but life in general.
Yeah, a way of being in the world.
And that really resonated with me. It's not about having all the answers. It's about that process of questioning, exploring, refining your understanding.
And being okay with not always getting it right.
Right. One thing I found really insightful was the emphasis on the why behind thinking about thinking.
Oh, absolutely. We kind of go through life on autopilot, accepting things, making decisions, without really examining the processes behind them.
Yeah, we don't stop to ask, why do I think this way? What assumptions am I making? Could my biases be influencing me?
Right. And this guide pushes us to do that, to recognize that our thinking isn't always as objective as we think it is. We have blind spots, we make mistakes, and that's okay.
It's about being aware of those limitations and always trying to improve.
Exactly. And that brings us back to this idea of balance we've been talking about. It's not about rejecting emotions or intuition altogether.
Right, it's about finding a way to integrate them.
Yeah. Finding that sweet spot between openness and skepticism, logic and creativity, taking in information but also questioning it.
And that balance might look different for everyone.
Absolutely. This guide isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's more like a framework, a set of tools you can adapt to your own needs and goals.
So it's not being told how to think. It's being empowered to find your own best way of thinking.
I like that.
Yeah.
Toward the end of the intro, the author asks a really thought-provoking question.
Okay, what is it?
What if, instead of just accepting the world as it is, we asked ourselves, how could things be different? What if?
Wow. That really is thought-provoking. It's like a challenge to shift our perspective.
From passive to active.
From just taking things in to trying to shape our understanding of the world.
It's about cultivating curiosity, creativity, a willingness to challenge the status quo.
To imagine new possibilities. And I think that's a great note to end on.
I agree. By embracing that mindset, by constantly learning and growing, we can really unlock our full potential, not just as thinkers, but as human beings.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to ask you, what's one thing you'll take away from this exploration of how to think? What's one small step you can take today to become a more conscious, intentional thinker? The journey starts now. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.